I think it's recording sound, hopefully. Cool. So, as an introduction, can someone tell me like what APIs are from your understanding of it so far? There's no like right or wrong answer. How do I mute this? I feel like I just did this in the other lecture room. Yeah, or if you're like, I have no idea, that's also okay.
I mean, isn't like the one I always think of is like, I think there's an API for like the King County Metro system that basically is provided by them to get info on like where buses are at and are they later that then Google then uses for like their Maps app and like other apps use like One Bus Away and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like data that's available to use that can be updated in real time, I think, or it could just be a collection.
So it's an open source database?
Yeah, thank you. It can be open source. It can also be released by a company. So basically, it's data that's provided to you from different companies, different sources that you can use. It's available to the public depending on what kind of like security layer they have. But yeah, that's exactly it. Data that's provided to you by a specific resource that you can access. In specific cases, it can be real time. Things like the King County Metro API kind of has to be real time because otherwise no one would use it because all the data is going to be outdated. I specifically don't know how real time like our Google Books API is because it's just a collection of articles or books that returns data to you from a keyword search. But that's basically what it is. And what APIs do is it gives us an interface that we can use so that we can actually access that data. And it's a generalized format that everyone follows. You'll be familiar with like JSON data. So every single API that you're going to reference and use is always going to be formatted as JSON data, which is just a format that we use. It's technically like in JavaScript land, but we'll be using it here because that's what the general convention for using APIs and data structures are going to be when you're like interfacing with the web. And it's cool because now you're kind of like, there's more data that's available to you. There's more resources that are available to you where you don't have to sit there and figure out like what instances do you need to create? What data do I need to create? Like you don't have that responsibility anymore. That can be given to you from anywhere in the world at this point. And you'll notice like in this list, some of them require an API key to use, and depending on which API you specifically refer to, it might require you to use an API key, and there are sources out there that lets you generate an API key. So you'll have a key that's generated that you can use. Most of the time it's free. Sometimes depending on how secure the API is, it might not be free. You're not required to like, don't spend any money at all in the world of Mod 1. There's tons of other free resources out there that you can use. So don't like specifically look for something that's gonna ask for money. I feel like some APIs out there are super secure, so they will ask for money. I think there was like an airport API that had a lot of secure data, and they're like, you have to be a company to use this. And then OAuth technically will just be using like your Google account, depending on what account you're logging in with. Cool. So there's tons of resources here. If you decide to use an API for your project, I do want you within the first day to make sure that you can get data from it. You can use if it requires a key, you have that set up and you're able to use that inside of your program. That needs to be determined and finalized before you technically start on your project. We don't want you to get like 2 or 3 days in and have your API fail, or you spending as much time or spending that much time just to look up information and get data, because that's not what the focus is. The focus is building out a full project. Worst case, we have had students like transition into using the Faker Gem. The Faker Gem is still a great resource that's available to you. So if you don't end up using an API, there's the Faker Gem. And even then, if you don't end up using any of that, you can still create your own data. It just depends on how much work you want to put in on the front end side for creating that data and seeding your database from that point. Any questions on this? So I'll post this in Slack. You can take a look through. Depending on what your idea is, there will be resources available to you, just overall. And the way that typically we go to like a specific site to get data for example, like my Google Books, this is the URL that I'm gonna use. And this is a resource that's generated for me by the query that I search up. You can tell the last class that I used did the Bible, because, That's what they wanted to search up. Do you guys have any other suggestions you want to try to search? Could be anything. A book, author, huh?
Oh, just like Chronicles of Narnia.
The Chronicles of Narnia. Chronicle of, I hate spelling, Narnia. I love that book. So the main way this is formatted, specifically Google has like tons of APIs available to you. So there's a lot of resources just from Google itself. And the specific section that I want to look up is my books. And we'll dive deeper into this in Mod 2, how URLs are formatted, how these resources are structured, what convention to follow. For now, you can just say this is our main site that we're going to go to. This is the specific resource that I'm looking up. And this version is just what Google has provided us to use to look up the specific book. And so this is the URL they're using. And typically, if you ever notice, like sometimes you might have noticed if you accidentally put in a space, like in the URL, it's substituted with a foreign character. It could either be a plus sign or like the %20. That's the ASCII, or like that's the conversion that it has for spaces. So you might notice that. Typically, you don't put like plain spaces in a URL. And if we search this up, let me go ahead. So this is the direct URL that gives me access to this data. And let me load it. What do you notice? Oh, I don't have JSON viewer installed anymore. What do you notice about the structure that's been returned to me? So this is the data that I got. It's a hash. And this is something we're familiar with working just from like day one. So JSON data, at the crux of it, when we translate it into Ruby, is just like working with a hash. So you have a hash that's returned to you. This is technically its raw form. So ideally, if we like inspect this, technically, in its raw form, it's just a string of, you'll notice like there's strings around this. So if you like, can I do option? No, control, okay. I gotta figure out how to do zoom here. But you'll notice like, even though we see it as a hash, the text that was returned to you is just a string. So we see it as a hash like in its raw form, but really it's just a string that's returned to you that's formatted as a hash. So whenever we're looking at JSON data, and when we are working with them inside of our Ruby program, we are going to be treating it as a hash. So whenever you read from an API and you get data from an API, you're going to convert it into JSON data, and you're going to work with it like you do a hash. So that's how you're going to pull in that data, and that's how you're going to be using it inside of your programs. Any questions on this? And I'll walk you through how to convert this, how we are going to use this inside of our program too. Cool. So this is the data that we got, and you'll notice there's like kind, total items. So there's 2,119 items that was returned for Chronicles of Narnia, and it has all of this information in here. And we'll pick one of these to go through and use this data and create objects out of it. Where do you think the most important information is inside of here? So this is the first item that we're looking at. Take some time, like read through it. What was that? The ID. So there's an ID here, and that's nested under our items. And then if you take a look at the data, there's like a volume info. So here's the title. It's like The Complete Chronicles of Narnia. Authors is technically an array for now. There's a publisher, all that stuff. So if we wanted to pull this data out, you really have to pay attention to the hierarchy of where these key value pairs are stored inside of our hash, because we would need to kind of dive deep into this nested structure in order to get the data that we want. Sweet. So this is my data. This is the URL that gives me access to this. And you'll be doing something similar to this no matter what API you use. You have a resource that's available to you. You're going to use the URL format that they want you to use and pass in the parameters properly. You'll notice this like question mark in most queries that you're going to make. And this typically means anything after this question mark, this is the query that I'm passing in. This is what Google Books API is going to use to look up that data. So this is going to be pretty general format that you're also going to be using. And that's exactly what I have here. And I just have that there as reference so that I can use it wherever I want. You'll notice for now, I have the API structure, or I have this URL, I'm working from my seeds file. So typically, if you are storing data directly into your database from your API, it can happen in the seed. So right now, when I run rake db seed, it's going to read from the API, it's going to create my objects, and it's going to store it in the database. So now everything happens in one place. If anything gets corrupted, if you need to start over, you're just gonna delete the database if you need to and run rake db seed again, and it'll automatically seed your database. You can also move this to a separate file if you want. You're not required to do it like this. There's like a run file that's also provided to you in the Mod1 projects. You could do it in a run file if you want. You could do it in your command line interface directly and write a task for it. There's tons of different ways to do this. I'm just doing it in the seed because there's one way. This is one way to do it, and it's easy to kind of just seed your database right after you read from an API here. Cool. So first step, figure out the API that I want, figure out the pattern that I need, how I'm going to query this portion here. And then the gem that we are going to use to communicate with APIs inside of Ruby is this REST client gem. So this is a gem that Ruby provides us that allows me to communicate with APIs and get data back. And there's tons of different stuff that you can do with REST client. At the crux of it, anything that communicates with the web and gets data back is going to be using this gem. You'll notice this once we start using like Sinatra and Rails. But we're using REST client. So I've included it in my gem file, and I'm gonna go ahead and do a bundle install. And it installed my gems. REST client is in there somewhere. Here it is. And if I actually want to use this inside of my file, I'm going to send a GET request to this URL to get data back. That it's okay if like none of that phrase made sense at all. It'll make sense in Mod 2. That's totally fine. In essence, when we are communicating with different pages, with different servers in our website, we're going to send different kind of requests. You can imagine it. There's tons of different servers running around the world. Anytime I want to get any information back, I have to send a request to that server. The server will take a look at what I want, and it'll return that information back to me. Anytime that I'm communicating with the server to get some data back, we're going to coin it as a GET request. So that's what we're going to be using with our REST client gem to get data back from Google Books API. So I'm going to name a variable called request, response, because this is a response I'm going to get back. I'm going to say REST client dot get. So this is technically a GET request. I'm saying .get, and I'm just going to pass in, let me uncomment this. I'm going to pass in the URL that I want. So I'm saying go to this URL, get some data, and return it back to me. And I'm going to store that in response. And I'm going to put a binding.pry so we can see what this returns. And I'm going to run it. Technically, our seed file is just a Ruby file. So if you want to like debug what data is being returned to you or debug anything, you can put a binding.pry in there. And I hit my pry. So now let's take a look at response. It's very hard to see, like there's so much data in here. Our terminal's just like ... Cool, not very helpful for us. But you'll notice we got a response object back. So that's the type of thing that we got from REST client. And this 200 is just a status code that comes with this data that lets us know it was successful. So 200 is typically the code that you're going to get when something is successful. You got the data back that you wanted. So that's what this is saying. And you'll notice like the string we got the beginning of a hash, and then it never ends. But it is formatted as a string. So typically the body of this response is what contains the data that I want. So let's go ahead and take a look at body. And we got this beautiful, beautiful data. You'll notice it like starts out as a string. Each entry has a new line, and there's this like mess that it returned. Technically, everything we need is in here. Oh my God, what did I do? But it's not useful for us because we can't really, if we wanted to get, let's say, the publisher for that specific book, we'd have to somehow traverse this string, split it up by new lines, and then go to each element to get that data. which is possible, but it's super painful for us as developers because we don't want to go through that. There is a gem that's available to us. It's already given to us by Ruby that allows us to go through and convert this data that we have into a hash or into JSON data. So I can say json.parse, and I'll do response. Let me see if that goes through. So we got the exact same thing that we saw in here, except it's formatted as a hash. So the first step is to get the data that we want from whatever API that we're using, and then we're going to convert it into JSON data, which will allow us to work with this data as a hash inside of our Ruby program. So now you have 3 elements inside of this hash. Inside of items, there's all this data. It's the exact same thing, except it's formatted a little bit better, and it's easier for me to use. So now if did I store that in a variable? Let me store that in a variable. So now if I say JSON data dot keys, I have these 3 keys that I can work with. Which one of this actually contains the data that I need to go through and inspect? What was that? Items. So yeah, got total items here, kind. The items key though is what actually has this array of all the books that I want. So I can do something like books equals JSON data dot items. So now I have access to, oops, this is a hash. So I got to reference this as a hash. So now I have access to all the items. I do want to point out, this is not an indifferent hash. So if you do something like this, which we're familiar with doing, like using a symbol instead, it doesn't yell at you, it just says nil, which isn't helpful in Ruby, but I do want to point it out. If you try to access a key that's not there, or try to access something as a symbol when JSON data returns a hash of string key value pairs, it's just gonna not do anything, it'll return nil. So it technically won't break until you try to call something on it, and then it'll be like, you'll get that awesome error that's like, can't call the method on nil class, which you might have seen a bunch of times. But yeah, so make sure that when you reference those keys, we say JSON data items. That gives us items. And let's say I want to create a book. Which one should we pull out? We can say title, publisher, title, publisher, publish date, description maybe. Anything else? I'm like, there's so much stuff. We could do average rating. So we'll do title, published date, and average rating. Let's say those are the 3 columns that I want to store, the columns that I care about. How can I get to title? Taking a look at this first thing. Oops. So right now I did books equals JSON data of items, so that's what this is. And title is over here. Yeah, so I'd have to start out, go to volume info, and then get to title. What kind of data structure is books right now? An array. So in order to get to this specific title and volume, I'd have to iterate through and then pull out that data. So even though I still have access to those key value pairs, I need to be able to iterate through one by one and get that information out of them. So I'm going to go ahead and convert this, JSON.parse, and then I'll do response. And then, what was I going to do? Books equals JSON data of items. And this is one of those cases where you can do anything you want to iterate through. For now, I'll just print out the elements on the page, so I'll just do an each. So I'll say books.eachDo. Book end. So I got my books. So I'm in a single book, and we said we have to start out by going into volume info and then pulling out the title. So I can say books of volume info, and then pull out the title. And I'll put some like markers in here. Okay. So we can like see it a little better. Got some asterisk, cancel. And then I'll just print this out for now. And I'll say like, my laptop is freezing. It's like, what are you doing to me? Okay, so I got title. And how am I going to get to published date? Same thing. Instead of title, I'm going to say published date. So let me go ahead and add that. And then I'll copy this. And then the final thing was average rating. Is that also nested under volume info? I think it is. Sweet. I chose easy ones. Okay. So let me copy this and then I'll put this here too. That is average rating. Sweet. So let me exit out of this and do write DBC again. So we got a bunch of stuff printed out. Woo! I just put this here so it's a little bit easier to see. So this is the first part. We got the fields that we wanted, and we were able to parse that out from the JSON data. So in order to get the data out, you really need to investigate what your hash looks like, what the structure looks like, and then go from there. And you just need to deep dive and pull out the parameters that you need. The Star Wars API lab that you guys will be working on together, you'll also need to do that. You'll need to take a look at the Star Wars API, figure out what information that we want, look through those characters, and figure out how they're formatted so you can pull them out. And this is going to be the same for any API that you use. Sometimes the way that companies have decided to structure things, companies have decided to name things won't make sense to us. We'll be like, why did you do that? But it's just the way they decided, so we have to follow the convention that they have in order to get that data. Let me check on time. So the first part, getting that data from our API, if you are not storing anything in your database and you decide to just use that data and print it out to the user maybe, or not go any step farther, this would be fine. You can use it inside of your program just like this. However, in order to make your app more efficient, and in order to actually have some persistent, it's easier if you just store what you need inside of the database. There are times where if you're using an API key, it's going to expire and you won't have access to the data anymore. Or a lot of APIs have tons of data inside of it. You took a notice here, there's like 2,000 items in here. If you're querying something, making a call every single time, making a request every single time you want to get one piece of data, it's going to slow down your app and it's going to take a long time to run. So you have to really be thinking about portions of data that you want to pull out. How efficient do you want your app to run? I think I've had instances where students just like do rake DBC for a minute before the presentation. So they like load everything up and stuff. So maybe it's not a minute, but point being, like, these things are going to take time in order to seed your database, and be mindful of that, and also figure out how you're going to work with that inside of your program. So the first part, we got our data, and the second part is actually setting this up so that you can store this information inside of your database. And this is where we can merge together what we learned with Active Record and what we learned with databases to the data that you have that you're getting from the API. For now, if you take a look at this, oh wait, I didn't change this. Volume info, published. I was not even paying attention. Was it just printing out the same thing? Oh yeah, that's great. Whoops. Publish date, I'm gonna copy and paste it. And then average rating. Okay, cool. So now it should be like a little better. Cool. So right now we're getting title, publish date, and average rating. Ideally, you want this to match up with the columns that you create for your model in the database. So I'm going to start out by creating this in my database, and then I will link it with a model inside of my app. So I'm going to exit out of this. And this is going to be exactly what we did this morning. If you take a look at our rake tasks, since I'm still working with the same tasks, I'm going to be able to say rake db create migration. And I'm going to name this create books. Because the items that I'm looking at are books, my model is also going to be called books. My table is also going to be called books. Follow convention when you're creating your models and you're linking data that you get with your database. So I got my migration. It has the current timestamp. This is the name inside of my migrate folder. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to write my create table books do2. So I'm naming this after my table, and I'm going to say t.string title, t.string published date, t.string what was the other one? Oh, thanks. That's gonna be an integer. I think it's technically a float. Average rating. You'll notice this format, we've been using Ruby convention, and the way that our API data and keys were named is using camel case because it's following JavaScript convention. So even though they use camel case in the API itself, use Ruby convention when you're writing out your attributes using Active Record and attributes for your database. So I got my books table created with the proper fields that I want. And I'm going to do rake db migrate. Cool. So it was successful. I have this log that got created that it was able to create the table books. Now I have my database portion set up, and the next part is adding my model. I don't think I have a model created, so I'm going to create a models folder. Create, I think it's created. And I'm going to call this book.rb. And inside of here, I don't have to do anything. I'm just going to say active record migration or active record base. And that's it. Not adding anything else in here for now, but I have my model set up in order to link my database to my book. And once I go into my seed, before I was just printing stuff to the screen. Now I can store this in a variable. Let me just, or I'll just do it from here. So in order to link this to my model, I'm going to use the create to insert this data inside of my model. So I'm going to say book.create and line up the parameters that I want with the columns inside of my database. So I'm going to say title. I'm just going to copy and paste this for now. Ideally, you'd probably want to store this in a variable. And then publish date. Published date will be this. And then I'll say average rating will be this. So ideally, if you're working with like more than one model and you're seeding more than one model, make sure this is going to line up with what you want to do. I'm going to split this so I can see it a little better. So I don't think that should break anything. Cool. So in order to get this line implemented in my seed file, I set up the proper schema that I wanted for my database. So I have the proper schema and table that I want, and I set up the proper, oh my gosh, is this another book.rb? Oops. I think that's from another one. Which one is it gonna read? We'll see. Yeah, this is from another project I did before, so that's why book is there. Either or. And I set up the book portion inside of my model here. So let's do, let me take out the try in my seed. And I'll do rake db. Implicit conversion of float into string. Ooh, okay. That is one thing to keep in mind. Everything that's returned from here is a string. So if you're storing an integer or anything like that, do that conversion before you store it in the database. Let me see if that fixed it. Nope, no implicit. But what's this doing? No implicit conversion of float. Can I not do this? Okay, I'll have to debug this further. Like, wow. I should convert it. It might not like me converting it inside of here. Maybe. No. Okay. Why is this not converting? Let me double check the data type. What is this string? I don't know why it's not working. But I usually just do like straight strings, but should be able to store it. I feel like 2f is, let me put a binding dot right here. I'm like, I tried. Okay, let me do DDC. Doesn't like. Oh, wait. It's not even the right center. Oh. Okay, well. It didn't like printing out. That makes sense. Cool. So I was complaining because this was a float and I was concatenating it with a string. Which makes sense. So I'm going to run this again. I just wanted to see. Go. Alright. Sweet. Yeah, that was totally error on my part because you can't print out non-string characters. Totally fine. But you were able to go through the loop and create book instances to store in your database. So this is automatically going to insert that data. So now if I do array console, and I also have it printed out here, which you technically don't need to do. But now if I do book.all, I have all the instances of book that I've created here. You'll notice there's only 12. Google has a limit of how many books it's going to display in each iteration. So if you want to get like all 2,000, you're going to iterate through a loop and type in whichever parameters you need. So you get to control how much data you actually want to pull. Most of the time, you don't want to just like get all 2,000 books and store it in your database. You want to be a little bit selective about it. So you get to control how many you want, and you'll be able to do that by just writing a loop. But in essence, these are the steps that you'll take to read data from an API and convert it to whatever structure you need to store in your database. This will be coupled with getting user data so that you can use the input that they enter and then use that to seed your database, which will be another step you'll be using when you build out your CLI app. And the Star Wars lab that you're going to do is also going to walk you through that. It'll have you get input from the user and use that so that you can actually process that and seed your database with it. Cool. Any questions? All right. I just wanted to give you a quick walkthrough of how to use an API, how to get data with it. This is just one resource, but there's tons out there, so do your research. If you do decide to use an API, figure out which one you want, how you're going to get access to the data. And when you're connecting it with the database, these are the steps that you're going to follow. So you can do this in your project if you want to use APIs in it. Cool. I'll stop there for now. And from now until I think for the rest of the day, you'll be working on Swappy. And after you finish, catch up with Active Record stuff. And tomorrow morning, we'll do Introduction to Projects. Cool.